We left off last time with a discussion of rhetoric and whether it's what it is and whether it should be ever used. And then we transitioned into propaganda. And we noted, perhaps too quickly, that oftentimes rhetoric can be conflated with propaganda. And propaganda, as we know, historically has had a very negative connotation. Notice again the word connotations. That's the sense that the word propaganda has. Almost always negative. And then W.B. Du Bois comes along and says, well, perhaps we ought to be able to engage in positive propaganda. And then I ended with a discussion of some comedians, contemporary comedians, Dave Chappelle in particular, who might be an advocate for what Du Bois calls a positive propagandist. He uses language and his performances as a means to cajole, to harangue. He gets at our emotions. He doesn't always say things that are precisely true, because comedians don't do that. And by the way, I discussed him last time before knowing about his new Netflix special, which, has anyone seen that? Came out just a little bit ago. And indeed, he found that line and went back and forth on it. But in that performance, he states very clearly, you need to listen to what I'm saying. Listen to the words that I'm saying. And the people who are detractors against his position, his views, will find maybe there's not that big a disagreement, ultimately. It's hard to say. And I'll talk more about that if we have a chance. But I've had comedy and humor, subversive humor and so forth on my mind because this last weekend I was at a conference. It was in Florida, but I chose not to go to Florida because it's Florida and things aren't great there now. I wish I could have gone. It's the Lighthearted Philosophers Society, my favorite conference of the year. So I ended up just presenting via the Zoom, which was fine, not ideal. But coincidentally, next reading on the 14th, this Thursday, one of the readings is from Eugenio Zaldivar, who was at the conference as well. And his short paper, Tendentious Jokes Are Immoral. And there we're going to get at discussion of stereotypes, which is sort of transitioning from our discussion today. And I've mentioned emotions. I've mentioned emotions in relation to argumentation. And in most of the instances we've discussed it, it's been negative. However, I've been, I hope, cautious to avoid this strict dichotomy, this idea that emotions and reason are separate compartments of ourselves, and that we can divide them. And as you'll see, finally now we get to a reading that addresses this very point, that reading from Linda Elder. She and her husband Paul Elder were early proponents of what is now this movement of critical thinking in schools, going back to the mid-'80s. I saw them they presented colleges and campuses all over the place. I don't know if they still do it. But they came up with their own pamphlets, their own presentation of critical thinking. And Elder herself makes the case that understanding how to think critically can affect also how we feel, which can affect our lives in a positive way. Now, maybe she's a bit too positive with respect to the role that critical thinking can play in our lives. We'll see. But it is interesting how important she sees critical thinking to be. And she's spoken to, what did she say, 50,000 or more students over the years in presenting techniques of critical thinking, and has played a significant role in, for better or worse, I guess, all colleges having critical thinking as part of their mission statements, of their outcomes. It's in every discipline you take. We need critical thinking in literature. We need critical thinking in English. We need critical thinking in biology. Are these all the same things? Is critical thinking a general tool or skill, or is it specific to each discipline? That's something that we started the semester questioning, going back to Daniel Willingham's article, What is Critical Thinking and Why is it so hard to teach? I prefer just calling it inductive logic. That way it fits more clearly in the discipline of philosophy. But we'll see, I think, and I hope we have so far, that this conception of critical thinking using the tools of informal logic, inductive logic, spread out into all other areas of your lives, but also, of course, all of your other disciplines. So, before I get to Linda Elder and her nuanced account of emotion and critical thinking in her paper, Critical Thinking and Emotional Intelligence, I want to spend some more time on the negatives. And to use her language, egocentric thinking. What is the ego? The I, the self, as the center. And she's going to say, instead of dividing up our minds into emotion and reason, we ought to divide it up into egocentric and non-egocentric thinking. Have that in the background as we go through this. And maybe consider, from Linda Elder's perspective, all these errors in reasoning, and there's a lot of them I'm going to go through here. This is the most we'll have gone through in one setting, as egocentric thinking as opposed to just failures in reasoning, which is not necessarily separate, different things. Quickly review, what's a fallacy?
Error in reasoning.
Error in reasoning, yes. Is a statement that is false automatically a fallacy? No, it's just a false claim. But if that false claim is part of a larger argument, we can potentially see it as a mistake. Because it's a fallacy, an error, a cheat, only if you're playing the game of argument. If I'm just talking to you, and we're just bullshitting, or whatever, I'm not engaged in a fallacy if I say something that isn't true. And maybe even if I'm engaged in comedy, I'm not engaged in fallacies, because it's a different game with its own separate set of rules. In Wittgenstein's language, it's a language game that has different rules than an argument. And if I'm not playing the game of argumentation, you can't call me out for being guilty of a fallacy. But if I'm attempting to convince you that something is true or false, implicitly I've adopted the rules of argumentation, and I'm playing that game, whether I realize it or not. And you need to be able to point out to someone, you've broken the rules here. Don't call him a cheater, but you've made a mistake. And it's a common mistake. It's so common, there's even a name for it. And maybe even point out the times that you've been guilty of fallacies. That lessens the blow of accusing somebody of being guilty of a fallacy. A fallacy is it's cheating in the game of argumentation. There are rules to argument, and I think argumentation is probably the best game in town insofar as we want to convince others. Remember again, as this motif throughout so far, persuasion is different than convincing. I can persuade you with fear. I can persuade you with force. But persuading does not the same thing as convincing. Persuading can change your actions. But that doesn't mean it's changed your beliefs. Let's start with an example. I'm going to give you two arguments. Your job is to tell me which one is better and then why. Okay? Ready? You just shout it out. Here's the first argument. Quote, the death penalty is unevenly distributed to poor minorities who do not receive adequate counsel. I think that should be counsel with a CEO. Some of whom have recently been exonerated through the works of the nonprofit group, the Innocence Project. Therefore, conclusion, we should abolish the death penalty. So there's argument number one. And it comes from this person, Sister Helen Préjean, a famous Catholic nun. So that's her argument. There she is. Nice smiley face. Remember that. Here's the second argument from this guy. Boom. Charles Manson. And just as a reminder, in case you didn't see it, I have an arrow pointing to the swastika that's on his forehead, just to get context of who's saying this. So do you remember the earlier argument? Here's Manson's argument. Which is the superior bit of reasoning? And why? Of course. Always have to ask that part. Silence implies, what does it imply? I guess anything I wanted to. What do you think? Which argument's better? Préjean's or Manson's? Go ahead.
Is it not like virtually the exact same? Very close. I was going to have to go back.
I've done it for you here. Here's their arguments. I've even reminded you about the swastika. And this is not, he's not being ironic and wearing it and implying, oh, no, it's okay. It's the Jain symbol of samsara, the wheel of birth, suffering, and death. That's what that original image was. But then the Nazis came and ruined it. And it now only means what the Nazis meant it to be. Which argument is superior now? Is it clear? Which one would be more convincing to you?
Probably from the lady that doesn't have a swastika on her head.
The lady who doesn't have a swastika on her face. Now, I've met her, Sister Helen Préjean. I've not had the fortune of meeting this guy. Although I've seen young kids with T-shirts with his face on it. looking crazy as hell. And I thought, what a cool kid that guy is, I guess, wearing a t-shirt of a mass murderer on his whatever. It annoyed me, actually. This was years ago, and I'm still pissed off about that. What are you doing? Get that. Anyway, I haven't met him, but I met her. Very nice. Very nice lady. She came to Rock Valley College, where I worked. I went to pick her up from the airport in Milwaukee, so that's an hour and a half away. I got to talk with her for an hour and a half. I was a little apprehensive, to be honest, but it was fantastic. What a kind, nice person, philosophically interested, morally upstanding. In fact, she wrote the book Dead Man Walking, which became a film. Dead Man Walking. And it was an argument against the death penalty. So she wants to abolish the death penalty. Let's imagine so too does he. She's a lot nicer, as far as I know, and I didn't ask her. No swastikas anywhere on her person. Therefore, her argument is superior. Psychologically, I'll bet you would lean more toward her. But, of course, we say, they're identical arguments. They even have the same error. Where is it? Counsel. I'm pretty sure it's counsel. I'm actually not sure now. They're exactly the same. What is the fallacy when we say his argument's no good because he's got a swastika on his forehead? What's that fallacy called? Ad hominem, to the man, in this case, to the person. Here's their argument, and here's my reaction. It can't be any good because it came from him. You're attacking the person, not the person's argument. It's irrelevant. That swastika, believe it or not, is irrelevant. This doesn't mean that you don't worry, that there aren't red flags when you are looking at the origin of someone's argument. It is possible that someone may be an interested party. And an interested party is someone who stands to gain by you accepting their conclusion. That doesn't automatically mean their arguments are no good, or that you should see them with extreme caution. But you might want to be a little more concerned. To say their arguments are no good because they stand to gain is also a fallacy. It's an ad hominem fallacy, a variation of it. We'll talk more about interested parties when we look at credibility of sources and credibility of claims. Because technically, anyone who's presenting an argument is an interested party in getting you to accept their conclusion. Just because they want to be right and they want you to validate them. So in a sense, everyone is an interested party. Unless we take Socrates at his word when he says, I don't mind you correcting me. I prefer that if I'm wrong. And I think that's the ideal. To be so, disinterested is not the right word, because you can't be disengaged from your conclusion. You can't be, as Elder's going to put it, unemotional or no emotional connections to your conclusion, at least to some extent. But I want to be emotionally attached to what is the case, to what is true. And if I've got something mistaken in my reasoning, that is to say, I've got something mistaken about what I think is true about the world, I benefit from you correcting me, pointing it out, from you correcting my claims, not me. Again, get into the habit of that language. Separate the argument from the arguer to the extent that that's possible. If Charles Manson makes the argument, premise one, look at my smile, I'm a nice guy, I write great music. He does sing, he did. Recently died, I guess. I'm photogenic? Is that the word? I'm a people person. I'm a nice guy. I tell the truth. And I'm kind to others. Therefore, you should respect me. And then you respond with, but no. You're a pathological liar. You're a mass murderer. You're a horrible son of a bitch. You have a swastika on your forehead. Therefore, I don't respect you. Or whatever my other conclusion was. And then he responds, well, that's an ad hominem. You're attacking my character, not my argument. And then you respond with, your argument is about your character. I can attack your character if you're defending your character in your argument. Do you see the difference? It's not an ad hominem fallacy and again, attack. To reason about one's character if that is the issue at hand, right? It's almost always appealing to irrelevant features. And those irrelevant features are predominantly appealing to emotion in a particular way that's problematic. Keep in mind Frank Luntz's phrase, 80% of you is emotional. Only 20% intellect, much more interested in the emotional. That's potentially a problem. Let's look at a quick example. Hugh Hefner also recently passed away. Change it. Hugh Hefner of Playboy argues against censorship of pornography. He did that. He did that through the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. And I don't know, probably till the point of his death. Here's a variation of his argument. Premise 1, censorship of pornography violates freedom of speech and expression. Premise 2, such rights are enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, freedom of speech and expression. Pornography is a mode of speech expression. Here maybe you have trouble with, but let's move on. Premise 4, censorship of pornography is wrong. And then you respond with all of that, but he's an immature, self-indulgent millionaire who never grew out of the fantasies of his youth. And that's your response to this. Bad response. That's an ad hominem. You're attacking. Even if all of this is true, which, by the way, it is, it's irrelevant to his arguments. If you're going to respond to the argument, respond to premise 3. For example, we need more argument, more premises, justification that pornography constitutes free speech, expression, and so forth. There's an interesting debate. But you haven't done anything by saying he's this. That's a deflection. It's basically saying he's a bad person, therefore his arguments must be bad. And now you realize how ridiculous that is. You know that now. But be aware of it when you fall prey to this. Be metacognitive, aware of your own thinking. Why is it you agree or disagree with this individual? Are you falling prey to one of these errors? And here is an image of him in his smoking jacket with his two wives. I don't know. It's the show, I forgot what it's called. It was on the air for a long time. And I did watch it. I'm not embarrassed to tell you. It was a terrible show. And it is accurate. He was a self-indulgent millionaire. But it's irrelevant to his arguments. You're engaged in an ad hominem if you're attacking him as a person. Do you see? The Girls Next Door. Is that what it's called? Come on. Somebody saw it. Okay, I was kidding. I've also not seen it. It's too late. What was it?
Oh, I said it was just you.
Yeah, I guess so. No, my wife watched it too, so it's okay then. All right, argumentum ad hominem. You don't need to use all the Latin there, but it's to the person. Arguing against the person rather than the argument. And there's a bunch of kinds of them. And sometimes this is broken up into 3 separate ones. I'm going to put them all into one. The inconsistency ad hominem, there's a variation of it known as the you-too fallacy, or the two wrongs make a right fallacy. Right? You're arguing one thing, but you're doing the thing you're arguing against. Therefore, your argument's no good. That's a variation of that. The most obvious and easily recognized, and unfortunately most commonly used, is the first one. Personal attack. Attacking the character. It's astonishing how often it's used and how obviously flawed it is. Why does it get used so often? What's the answer?
It's easy, because that's in the scripture.
It's easy, and
People are emotional.
people are emotional, therefore it works. That's why people do it, because it works. What does it work to do? Persuade. Persuade. Not convince. And they're almost always irrelevant. Oh, come on. In each case, the error is relying on irrelevant premises. Premises that are not connected logically to your conclusion. To give you a joking example, a guy goes into a cafe, orders a pastry and sits down. A few seconds later, he brings the pastry back to the counter and asks to exchange it for a glass of liquor. The proprietor agrees, which is weird. I didn't eat this. Can I exchange it? Yeah, sure. I'm sure you didn't breathe on it or touch it or whatever. He goes back to his seat, slowly finishes his drink, gets up to leave, and then, hey, says the proprietor, you can't leave until you pay for that drink. But I exchanged my pastry for it. But you didn't pay for the pastry either. But I hadn't eaten it. That's funny. That's clever. Isn't that clever? The fact that you hadn't eaten it is irrelevant to the fact that you didn't pay for it. Do you see? It's really quite clever. And this is Freud. That's what he looks like. Before a joke and after. And that's just a cigar for you psychoanalysts out there. It's not a penis. Freud always associated things with mothers and penises. I'm kidding. I'm exaggerating. I'm caricaturing Freud. he talked also about having sex with your mother. I'm sorry. Once again, I apologize. But it's a joke, so I'm still in that joke mode. I hadn't eaten. That's irrelevant. You're accused of attempted murder. But I didn't succeed. Oh, well then, go ahead. You're free to go. That fact that you didn't succeed in your attempt is irrelevant to the fact that you were trying to break the law, which, by the way, is going on now. I'm not going to get into the details of the political disputes about the prior administration, but there are accusations of an attempt at breaking the law. And the defense, we didn't succeed. Therefore what?
We didn't break it.
Therefore we didn't break the law. Yes, I tried to kill him, but I failed. I missed him. Oh, it is interesting. The punishment for attempted murder is not the same as successful murder. Why is that? Is intention not all of it? Apparently consequences matter. More on that much later when we get to ethics and utilitarianism, for example. Here's an example of a personal ad hominem. And from Bill Maher, who I just watched his latest episode last night, but this is not from last night. He does reference Trump, Bill Maher does, but not in this way. And there's a link to the episode that I'm discussing here. In the episode, he uses images. I'll show you the images, which is me also perpetrating these rhetorical devices. So we'll talk about that. But he calls Trump Orange Hitler. And then moments later says, we have to be careful with our language. Civility is nearly dead. And nobody called him out on it. Nobody said, oh, Bill, 3 seconds ago you equated the president to Orange Hitler. That's uncivil. No, he's a comedian. Does he get a pass? I'm sorry, do I get a pass for showing these things? These are the images he showed. And notice I'm perpetrating and perpetuating that. And maybe you have to, a little. Maybe you have to engage in positive propaganda. When we talk about stereotypes next time, it's hard to talk about stereotypes and the problems with them without talking about the stereotypes and then bringing them to consciousness. And there's a worry in that. There's a problem in doing that. It's kind of like the use mention. These are words you can't say. Which ones, Dad? Which ones can't I say? Son, don't say fuck. Then there's laughter. It's hard to call attention to something that's problematic, but that's subtle, without then perpetuating that very thing. Now, what I just did here is not subtle. This is me continuing that on purpose. Now, we might say, but wait a minute, doesn't Trump deserve the ad hominem against him? Because after all, there's a link to the complete list. After all, isn't he guilty of ad hominem? Yes, he certainly is. He's better at it than anyone I've ever seen. He's incredible at his use of ad hominem. That's a kind of rhetorical device. And it's successful. And it's not to say that his opponents don't use it. They certainly do. We just saw Bill Maher as an example. But they're not as successful at doing it. Usually we see the ad hominem of whatever variety, but in particular the ad hominem. Usually that comes about, not always, but usually because there is a recognition at some level, or lack of concern at some level, that I don't have the reasons, I don't have the facts, I don't have the argument on my side. In fact, there's a joke about this years ago. In England, there's the solicitor and the, what's the other term with the attorney? There's one who argues the case and one who does the footwork to build the case. And the guy who's about to argue the case is waiting for the other guy to bring the case to argue. And the guy shows up late and says, boom, here's this one. On the document, it just says one thing. We don't have a case. We don't have an argument. Attack the opposing counsel. Or critique the opposing counsel's credibility. Attack their character. And does this happen? Of course it does. And what happens when a whistleblower has evidence, has data, has facts that show, here's what the company was doing. Here's all the data. And what's the response? Not always, but what?
A personal attack to discredit them?
A personal attack to discredit them, and usually it is, in some form or another, they are a former disgruntled employee. And by doing that, the assumption is, whatever they've said is irrelevant, because their disgruntledness makes their arguments no good. It is a quick and successful, sadly, dismissal of arguments by diverting attention to logically irrelevant features or factors. They may be disgruntled, but that's not mutually exclusive with their capacity to construct a good argument. I don't know where we are with that on Facebook, but that's the case that's going on now. Whether or not she'll be deemed, her name is, what's her name? The whistleblower who shows that Facebook is using certain kinds of algorithms to push the more aggressive, hate-filled, fear-filled language and images and memes and news stories, and thereby creating a great deal bit more divisiveness. Her name is, nobody knows?
I know who she is, but...
Yeah, I can see her face and I can see the name, but I can't read it. That's weird. I can't get it. In any case, we'll see what happens to her. If she's responded to with argument, with reason, with justification, or if they're merely character attacks. Okay, so that's the most common ad hominem attack, personal attack. The most difficult to explain and confusing one is the inconsistency ad hominem. Now this is, I'll give you an example. This is a quote from, or paraphrase from this guy, who, by the way, he also passed away recently, as it turns out. That's the best picture I could find of him, of Rush Limbaugh. Do you believe that? You don't believe that. You shouldn't. He's a very popular figure. I chose that picture. Why did I choose it? I'm pushing a kind of narrative here, aren't I? That's a rhetorical use of imagery. Now, I guess I've freed myself of guilt by telling you that I've done that. There's also a little parallipsis in there, perhaps. At one point, Rush Limbaugh says, going back, this is like 15 years now, or more, President Bush in his first term made no efforts to halt climate change and seemed to think that human activity had no conclusive effect on global warming. And indeed, that was the case. President Bush in his first term didn't do anything about climate change. In fact, some of his policies probably exacerbated it. But Bush came up with a different idea in his second term. Now, all of a sudden, this phrase, all of a sudden, he argues that the U.S. has a responsibility to reduce emissions. Can you say flip-flop? What's flip-flop? That was a term that was used a lot in the election in 2004. John Kerry was accused of flip-flopping, that is, changing his position. I was for the Iraq War before I was against it, I think he said at one point. Like, what the hell does that mean? If you're just changing your minds based upon what you perceive to be the whims of the populace, that's a potential problem. But if I'm changing my mind because at this point, here I've got my web of beliefs already written out. Here's Bush and his web of beliefs for his first term. And in no point does he have any beliefs there about climate change as being caused by human activity and being a problem. But time then elapses. Evidence may be acquired. It was already there. He may have only gotten to it late in the game, let's say. In fact, that's what his claim was. And now he has a new web of beliefs that's different than the earlier one. Where is the fallacy? The fallacy is with Limbaugh's response, that his current argument that climate change is a problem and we need to do something about it, that conclusion can't follow because it's inconsistent with an earlier version of President Bush's web of beliefs. Is this set of beliefs inconsistent with this one? Yes. But so what? As long as there were reasons to change my belief. The fallacy is on the second person. Bush presents an argument. His argument is different than what it was in the past. The response is, since your argument is not consistent with what you believed before, therefore your current argument is no good. No, that's a fallacy, inconsistency, ad hominem. There's a variation of this with Clinton. Again, that's the best picture I could find. We need a president with steady hands, not one who says he is neutral on Monday, pro-Israel on Tuesday, and who knows what on Wednesday. And this reminded me of that wonderful comedic performance. Again, I apologize if it's too much comedy for you. Stephen Colbert and his correspondence dinner presentation. Years ago, that's how they went. You'd have a correspondence dinner, which is where a comedian would come, usually a comedian, and roast the president and the media. The media would be there, the president would be there, all the bigwigs. It's where the media and the White House are kind of come together, whereas they're divided in those other cases. And Colbert says to Bush, President Bush, who's right there, He says, you and me, we're the same. We're consistent in our system of beliefs. I'm paraphrasing. We believe the same thing on Wednesday that we believed on Monday, no matter what happens on Tuesday. And that was funny, because what kind of consistency is that? To borrow from Ralph Waldo Emerson, it is a foolish consistency. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. I wanted to quote that because this word hobgoblin, you just don't hear it much these days. It's a great word. Great word, is it not? Yeah. There's Waldo, by the way. So, hobgoblin, look, I don't know what it is. It sounds negative. Hobgoblin. You know what it is?
Oh, no. You got like a little Waldo down in the O next time?
I should.
Yeah.
Note to self. That's good stuff. And then I'll put a little asterisk, very tiny, noting your suggestion to give credit. So it is inconsistent, but it's not a problem for me that I have a different set of beliefs. The problem of being inconsistent is if my current web of beliefs has inconsistencies in it. That we'll talk about next time when we look at virtues and vices of beliefs. But I, of course, can change my mind if I've got good reasons. It would be silly to say, here's my web of beliefs, here's evidence that's convincing, that's accurate, backed up, that would show I've been mistaken here, and then not change my mind. Well, I should be rewarded for being consistent. No, not when you have evidence that should have changed your mind.
Could you explain the, in parentheses, the you two or two wrongs make a right part of the inconsistency?
Can I? Yes. That's amazing. It's right here. Another version of it is, look, I make an argument. Let's, the United States government makes an argument. Premise one, Iran is an unstable dictatorship. It's ruled by people who want to wipe Israel off the map, as they've said before. Premise three, nuclear weapons in the hands of Iranians would be disastrous. Therefore, and you can add more premises, therefore, Iran should not have weapons of mass destruction, should not have nuclear weapons. That's an argument that the United States makes. What would be an example of a U2 fallacy? A fallacy of inconsistency perpetrated by the Iranians in response to that argument I just gave. Wait for the truck. Go ahead.
America has like the most nukes of any country in the world.
Yes! What's the U2 fallacy response? Fallacious response? United States makes this argument. Iran shouldn't have weapons of mass destruction, shouldn't have nuclear weapons. And then the Iranian government says, but you have nuclear weapons more than anyone. Oh, and also, you've used them. And you're the only country that's ever used them. You used two of them. Now, granted, you used them to end World War II. But historians debate whether that was necessary. And we're not going to get into that debate now. Do you see how that works? The United States does have nuclear weapons. We have way more than anyone else. And we're the only ones that have used them. Those are all facts. But do those facts tell against? Are those refutations of the argument that Iran shouldn't have nuclear weapons? Are we being hypocritical? Yes. Is being a hypocrite the same as reasoning poorly? It is. Oh, why?
Wait, can you repeat that?
Yes. Actually, let me do it with this. So years ago, when my daughter was like 3, I had a conversation with her, because I like to be on the ball, make sure I cover all my bases early on. I said to Lola, you need to not use heroin. It's highly addictive. It will lead to you losing friends, your job. You will very likely end up in a ditch somewhere. And then she said, but Dad, you're shooting up right now. Or whatever it is you do with heroin. Therefore, your conclusion that heroin is wrong does not follow. To which I said, Lola, do as I say, not as I do. Do you see? Her argument, her rebuttal to my argument is an example of the U2 fallacy, the inconsistency ad hominem. And then she accuses me of a slippery slope fallacy too. There she was. That's what she looked like when she considered her. I'm obviously joking. Never did we have this conversation yet. Slippery slope fallacy is that once you start taking heroin, oh, what's the next? You're going to end up in a ditch. We'll talk more about slippery slope later. That's not clearly a slippery slope fallacy. Once you start taking heroin, things aren't going to go well for you. And so we'll see the difference between a slippery slope fallacy and a real slippery slope that we should be legitimately concerned about.
Is slippery slope fallacy the Armageddon one
Yes.
you were talking about? Okay.
You try heroin, Lola, what's next? End of the world. Dad, you need to give me some of the logical connections between those two claims. Here's the fallacy. It's on her, hypothetically. Right? She's attacking my argument. Yes, I'm being inconsistent. My actions go against my conclusion. I'm not practicing what I preach. Does that make what I preach false? It makes me a hypocrite. It makes my actions inconsistent with my reasons. That's a problem, but that doesn't make my argument fail. To say that it does is to be guilty of the ad hominem inconsistency, or the U2 fallacy. Does that clarify it?
Yeah, it does.
Also, don't do drugs. How about that? That's our lesson for today. Don't do drugs. Now, there are also these kinds of fallacies where you say, look, because all the other ones were negative, but there are positive ones. I like this argument. Why? Well, it came from this guy, and Aristotle's great. He is. He's great. He's a great philosopher, known as the philosopher for almost 1,000 years. When you call somebody the philosopher, that assumes there aren't any others. And there were. So it's an impressive moniker. But he did at one point make the case that women and slaves should be in the position that they're in, their inferior social status. He said a lot of things. A lot of things that we look at now and say, well, that's ridiculous. Birds don't fly because they're lighter than air. That's just false. Your brain isn't used to cool the blood. That's not true. The positive ad hominem is to say, I like this person, therefore I like their argument. Do you see how easy that is? And how ridiculous it sounds? But it happens. Be cautious about where and why you're accepting a conclusion. And is it because you have some connection to the person presenting it? And here's an interesting example from the poet Eustace Budgell, who committed suicide by jumping off a bridge. What Cato did and Addison approved cannot be wrong, he said in the letter, in the note. Which is another way of saying, these are respected individuals. I like them. Therefore, what they say is true. Really, all the time? I mean, all parents know this. Are you going to jump off a bridge just because your friends are doing it? I mean, not to make light of the situation, but this is the reasoning that was used there. Can the individuals who are great at whatever other endeavors be mistaken? Yes, of course they can. A variation of this is almost more of a rhetorical device. I kind of just threw it in here. And it's similar to the proof surrogate, is this notion of apple polishing. Now, you all won't do this. And I think it came from originally when kids would bring apples to their teachers, which is doesn't happen anymore. I can't remember the last time I got an apple from a student. I'm not asking for it, by the way. I prefer cash. But it's basically where I appeal. I say, look, I love your class. It's awesome. I'm having so much fun, learning so much. Can we talk about my grade? That comes right after you've just appealed to pride. And if I'm falling prey to this reasoning, to this rhetorical appeal to emotion, in this case pride or hubris, I might come to a conclusion or arrive at an action that is unjustified. There's also appeal to pity that's similar to this, where I say, I give special dispensation because I've been convinced by your appealing to my pity, which is different than appealing to compassion. I can make an argument that's based on compassion, and this will tie into elder in a moment, that is different than pity. Pity is feeling bad for someone. Sucks to be in your position. But empathy, compassion is suffering with, and you can make the case that you should help this person. Not just because they're having a bad time, but here are other reasons why. Appealing to your compassion, your emotion. It isn't just pure reason. here are the logical reasons you should help this person. And there's no emotion whatsoever, because I don't want to cloud my thinking with emotion. That's not what's going to be happening. I'll get into that in more detail in a moment. Okay, this one you don't need to write down. I made up a fallacy. It hasn't taken off yet. I don't know why. But it's when somebody presents an argument from the rapper Eminem. Let's say Eminem makes an argument, and then you respond to Eminem with, that argument sucks. Why? Well, because it came from Eminem. That is an ad hominem fallacy. What kind of ad hominem fallacy? The ad hominem. Yes, it is rare, and that's what he looks like when somebody accuses him of not having a good argument. He does make arguments, doesn't he, in his raps? Just started listening back to some old late 90s rap. Boy, did they really impress themselves with their ability to rap. In every song, they tell us how amazing they are. And that if you don't think they're amazing, well, they'll kill your family. It's incredible. And some of this, the music is really impressive. And he's pretty fast. He's good. But nevertheless, that's irrelevant. In fact, that's the point of this. The fallacies of irrelevant premises. Here's another example of a fallacy. The last one we'll cover with respect to ad hominem. The genetic fallacy. Circumstantial ad hominem. Genetic meaning genesis, the origin of it. So, a person who's a Hindu says you shouldn't eat meat. And you respond, and let's say they have an argument. But you respond, well, of course they're going to reason that way. They're Hindu, and Hindus don't eat meat. Therefore, their argument is no good. Or, he's a Texas rancher. Of course he's going to argue we should eat meat. Therefore, his argument's no good because of where it comes from. That is saying that the argument's no good without looking at the reasoning itself. To make it clear, Bill claims that 1 + 1 = 2, but he's a Republican, so his claim is false. Obviously, that's silly, but that's a variation of the genetic fallacy. And it's something to think about. What if a Texas rancher argues we should be vegetarian? Does that argument now hold greater value, greater worth, greater convincing power than one that comes from a Texas rancher who says we should eat meat? Is it something about it being unexpected source? Something to consider. The genetic fallacy can be found in attacking a position because of its origins. Let's imagine an argument that somebody says you shouldn't wear a wedding ring because wearing a wedding ring is a sexist practice. Why do you say that? Well, here's the argument. Premise 1, wedding rings were originally symbols of property, such that the woman would be, in a sense, tied to the man, connected, a piece of their property now. Premise 2, the symbol means the same thing now as it did then. That, of course, once you've made it explicit, it's clear that that's the crux of the argument. That needs way more support. But let's assume it's true. Such actions constitute a sexist practice. Therefore, one who follows this practice is now engaging in a sexist practice. Yes, that follows only if this is true. And if you can make the case that it's true, you avoid the fallacy, the genetic fallacy, of saying this is a sexist practice because it was originally a sexist practice. Go ahead.
Wouldn't that be Izod fallacy too? Because it's referring to something that is done before, so it should be done now.
Close. It's more of an appeal to tradition, which is a variation of this. The is-ought fallacy is saying, here's a description of the way the world is. Here are the facts. And then, boom, I derive a moral claim from that. Therefore, it ought to be this way, or it ought not be this way. I remember a discussion with someone who was talking about fairness with taxation. Here are the facts. This isn't conceptual. These are facts. And then jump to the conclusion that something was unfair. And the concept of fairness, that's very conceptual. And we'll get to that with moral reasoning later on. But you're right to note some connections here. That's the way it's always been, right? Well, you need to make the case that it still is that way. There's an interesting case to be made about statistics, the branch of that discipline, that it was developed around the 1880s or thereabouts by racists with racist intention. The goal of the development of statistics as a discipline, was to perpetrate racial hierarchies. And it's still that way now. But the argument to avoid the genetic fallacy must be that it's still that way now. It may be true that it was originated by racist individuals, and it may even be true that they intended it to be used for racist purposes. And in fact, when we look to a reading later on by Gregory Pappas on the 18th of November, we'll look at the American challenge, the tension between the values of the Anglo and the Hispanic world. We'll look at a similar case to be made. If we can make the case that statistics is currently being used in the same way that it was initially, then we can avoid that fallacy.
Well, I just wanted to mention, because I actually learned this in my research methods class, where an MIT researcher did find that, like, recently, that through coding and statistics that it was inherently racist.
Interesting.
So it was an interesting study to look at.
Yes, there's a lot in AI and the certain principles and variables that are used there that lead toward racism. And there's questions about logic, and we'll come to this in a couple of weeks. Some argue that Aristotelian logic, and here's the debate, is designed to create these strict dichotomies. It is designed to make the world broken up into binaries. You're male, you're female, you're good, you're evil, you're emotional or rational. Going back to Plato, if you're not rational, you're emotional. And if you're too emotional, or if you're just emotional, you can't be reasonable. You can't fit into the category of a rational human being. And that logical presumption has been used by colonizers to differentiate those who are capable of reason and those who are not. And guess who gets included in the not? More than 50% of the population, women, and way more than that when they are excluding anyone who isn't a European white male, landowning in particular. All of that, the argument goes, could go back to the origins of the development of formal logic, which seems absurd, because formal logic is as objective as it gets. We're using variables after all. We'll come back to that discussion with the Pappas reading later on. Okay, I'm winded. It must be all this smoke I'm inhaling. And the last thing I want to say about ad hominem is the poisoning the well fallacy. It's a preemptive ad hominem. It's an attacking a source before the source has said anything. And who's good at doing this? Well, we've mentioned his name. I apologize too many times. But he's just such a perfect exemplar of so many of these tools. He's really, really good at using these. And fake news is the one. It goes either direction, though, of course. If I'm on the left-leaning political spectrum, I'm going to discount everything from Fox News. It doesn't matter that Chris Wallace is a really good journalist. I might ignore everything that he says because it's from Fox News. And in doing so, I close off a possible avenue toward understanding, toward knowledge about the world. Likewise, as this link will show, I discount everything from these media sources. And if I get enough people to agree that those sources are flawed, they're poisoned from the outset, then nothing they say will be accepted. No matter how well researched, how accurate, how useful, how important the claims are, they're discounted. This has enormous implications. We'll talk about that when we get to questions of post-truth, fake news, and so forth. It's not a trivial matter. Yeah?
Is poisoning the well like a sub-fallacy of the genetic fallacy?
It is a variation of it. So the genetic fallacy is saying, here are the circumstances from which this information came, but it's ignoring the arguments of the source, and it's saying, it's preemptively exploding it. So before CNN or Fox or whoever says anything, it's already been discounted. Well, I read here this argument that this happens. Where did that come from? CNN, don't want to hear it, because that well is already poisoned. And the number of poisoned wells, the number of legitimate sources of information that have now been poisoned has increased exponentially. Which is to say, what qualifies as a legitimate source of information has become very, very, very narrow. And we'll see the problems of this as we go. Okay, this might outrage you in the fact that these things are happening. And what is the argument from outrage? What is outrage? Let me yell it for you. Yelling an argument will not make it stronger, but it does make for great news. The argument from outrage. Keep again in mind this idea that Elder's going to tell us, we'll get to in a second, or a couple minutes, that it isn't a difference of emotion and reason. It isn't that we reason poorly or not at all and let our emotions run wild. It's that we have egocentric thinking versus non-egocentric thinking. And maybe argument from outrage, when I'm enraged, that's where my ego is taking over, rather than I've just made a mistake in reasoning and I've let my emotions run wild. But notice what happens when we engage in argument by outrage. I'm going to show this clip because it's amazing. You can even watch it without the sound, and you'll still feel adrenaline. That's how good it is. Your job is to pay attention. What is the issue? It's not going to be obvious. What are the positions of the two? There's Geraldo Rivera and Bill O'Reilly. And then I want you to count the number of fallacies, the errors in reasoning that we've covered. Pay attention. It's hard to figure this out, but it is fun.
Thank goodness. Okay, sanctuary cities, what do you think?
I think you have the story almost exactly wrong, my friend. I think that we're talking about drunk driving. And, there were 347 drunk driving fatalities in the Commonwealth of Virginia in the year 2005. I think this may be the first drunk driving story we've done from Virginia. And the only reason it's news on the factor is because the driver was an illegal alien. What if his name was Bubba? What if his name was Buddy? What if his name was Bobby? It's not the same story, but still, my heart goes out to those parents.
I hope so.
But really, it does. But there are 17,000 families that suffered the way those parents have.
Yes.
It's not an illegal alien story, Bill. It's a drunk driving story. And I think you owe that
Here's why you're
poor
wrong,
lady
because-
mayor an apology.
No.
She doesn't enforce immigration policy.
She has set up a system in her city,
No, she
knowingly,
doesn't, Bill.
that
That's not
says the
true.
police
Don't
chief.
don't feed that. What's his name?
No, no,
Lou Dobbs' mom.
You
Lou Dobbs
listen to
has
me, I'll listen to
regenerated
you.
his dead career
All right.
on the backs of illegal aliens.
Well,
Let's not go there.
You listen to me,
The
I'll listen to
Minutemen
you.
are wearing guns now on the border.
You listen to me, I'll listen
So
to
what, they're
you.
going to start shooting illegal aliens?
When you enter this country illegally, number one, you have no right to be here. No right. That's the truth. And number two,
That's true.
when you're caught committing a crime, as this man was
He
4
was drunk in
times.
public twice.
Hold it. 4
And one time he was a drunk driver with no victims.
He should have been deported the first time, and he was not. And the reason he wasn't deported,
Because he didn't commit a felony.
doesn't make any difference.
And he didn't commit
committed
a misdemeanor.
crime.
He didn't commit a misdemeanor having to do with moral
All
turpitude
right,
either.
so let me get this straight.
Everyone followed the law. You owe everyone an apology from the governor
No, they
to
didn't.
the mayor down.
No, they didn't. Now, I just want to get this straight. You, Geraldo Rivera, with teenage daughters, are telling me that you are okay with somebody sneaking into the country, becoming drunk, get convicted of a DUI, and staying here.
My
You're all right
my
with that.
nightmare is my daughters having anything
you
to do with
okay
a
with
drunk.
that?
Let me finish my answer. My nightmare is my daughters having anything to do with a person driving drunk. That's my nightmare. It could be a Jewish drunk.
This
it could be
guy
a
didn't have
Polish
to be
drunk.
here.
It could be an Irish drunk.
No.
It could be an Italian drunk.
American
what the hell
crime,
difference does it
it
make?
makes plenty of difference.
It does not.
He
Bill.
doesn't have a right to
He
be
didn't commit
here.
a felony.
He doesn't have a right to be in this country.
What? But that has nothing to do with the
Yes,
fact that
it
he was
does.
a drunk.
He should have been
He was a
deported.
drunk. What?
He should have been deported, and this mayor and the police chief didn't deport him.
Listen, do you know how many people we have in jail? How many of them are illegal aliens? Illegal aliens commit crimes at a lower rate than citizens do.
This guy
They do.
shouldn't have been
Cool
here.
your jets. It has nothing to do with illegal aliens. It has to do with drunk driving.
It doesn't.
Don't obscure
He
a
should have
tragedy
been
to
deported.
make a cheap political
If
point.
I'm the father,
It's a cheap political
no,
point.
it isn't.
And you know
This
it.
is justice.
This has nothing to do
You
with that
want
poor
anarchy.
mayor.
You
This
want
has nothing to do with that mayor.
You want anarchy.
No, what
you
I
want
want-
open border anarchy.
What
That's
I
you
want is fairness. We have lured
Fairness,
these people.
bull.
We have lured these.
This is the
we
law.
have lured these people to this
Yeah.
country with a promise
Nobody
of
is-
jobs
this-
in a country where it's basically full domestic employment. We have for decades lured them here.
This
And now we're
family-
starting a mob scene.
This family
You
lured no
want
one.
your viewers to knocking on people's door.
Bull,
Are you an
that's bull.
illegal? I'm gonna take you outside and do
I
something
want the
to you.
law enforced.
History has seen what happens when you
I
single
want
out
the
people
law
like that.
enforced, and
But
you don't.
Bill,
You
half
don't.
of Congress, if they had the courage, the President of the United States, if you look at what he has to say, all want reasoned immigration reform.
Then
But to
do
take
that.
this tragedy in Virginia Beach and make it about illegal aliens
It
is a
is.
sin. That's a sin.
Bull, this family lured no one. This family lost their daughter and told me
347 drunk
Because
driving
the law-
fatalities in the Commonwealth of
we
Virginia.
deal with
Do we
Americans.
care about them?
We deal with Americans that way, and I deal with it all the time, and you know I do, with child predators and everything else.
But I back you with that, because it's a reasoned approach.
This
It
is
singles
reason.
out the perpetrators
You
who
don't
have
let these
no,
people
wait,
stay
wait, I
here.
think, let's calm down.
I'll give you the last
Okay.
word. You don't
A child predator is someone with a predilection to commit an offense against a juvenile. So you go, that because of that cause and effect, you go after the person who's perpetrating the offense. There's no cause and effect between his illegality and his
Sure
drunkenness.
there is. He's
The
irresponsible.
Latinos aren't more drunk than other people.
Latino bull, it's about Ramos. It's not Latino.
Right, I agree, and that's
should
right.
be
If
out.
Ramos was Raminsky, would we care?
We would certainly care.
If he was
he broke the
illegal.
law, he gets deported first
17,000
time.
fatalities drunk
First time.
driving.
All right, how much time do we have? We have 1 minute. We don't have any shows.
Well, thank you very much for asking me. You know, seriously, I think that one of the wonderful things about our network is that we are fair.
Okay, we'll stop on that point. Okay, first, obvious question. What is the issue that they're debating? Or issues? And that's going to be relevant, of course.
Well, they're both arguing two different points.
Exactly. And do we know which one? Which is which? What are the points?
His point is
That's
that,
O'Reilly, Geraldo.
Yeah, his point is that it's about drunk driving.
So, a person who, an undocumented, notice the language changes over time, and perhaps rightly so. Someone who's undocumented, crosses the border illegally, gets drunk, and I think committed, and then people died as a result.
Yeah.
Geraldo's addressing the drunk driving issue,
Yeah.
which was the proximate cause, so to speak, as opposed to the distal cause. The proximate cause is the drunk driving that led to him killing 2 or 3 people. Or is it one person? I can't remember now.
A number of people.
And O'Reilly is saying it's about his being an illegal immigrant. Did you want to add?
No, I was just gonna say, like, I think Geraldo's also arguing that it doesn't matter whether he's illegal or not. It should just only pertain to the fact that it is about drunk driving, right?
Right, and that issue gets obscured, so he's focusing on that. And he talks about there are 17,000 drunk driving cases in that Commonwealth where it happened. Why are we only focusing on this one? And O'Reilly responds with saying, it wouldn't have happened were he not allowed into the country. He broke into the country, so to speak. And that's the problem. And then what happens? They start talking past each other because they're talking about different things, and they get angry. What happens when they get angry? Their voices raise. What happens when their voices raise? They're not listening to what the other person has to say. How do you know they're not listening to what the other person has to say? What fallacy happened on both sides more than once?
Ad hominem.
Which one was the ad hominem?
What did he say? He said something, he's like, oh, you just want to live in a country that's lawless, anarchy.
Ah,
or
yes.
whatever."
That's not necessarily ad hominem, but I guess you could interpret it that way. That's a straw man fallacy. Because O'Reilly says to Geraldo, you want open border anarchy. You want no laws. Did anything Geraldo say come close to advocating for anything like that? No. But that's an easy target to attack. And it looks like O'Reilly wins that debate. Because Geraldo wanted something ridiculous. But didn't Geraldo do the same thing to O'Reilly? Same fallacy, straw man? What was it?
He said that, like, we saw in history what would happen if we don't let anyone in. Like, if we start picking and choosing who we prosecute. Or
And-
who we blame.
That's right. If we do what you're saying, Bill, then you're going to get the Minutemen, who are citizens who are going to the border armed. What are they going to do? Start shooting people? You want your viewers, he says to O'Reilly, you want your viewers to go door to door and ask, are you an illegal? Are you illegal? And then take them outside and do something to them. Did O'Reilly suggest anything of the kind? He did not. But the heated exchange, the outrage In the traditional view, emotion has overridden their reasoning. On Elder's interpretation, egocentricity has overridden our non-egocentric viewpoint. And yes, it leads to shouting. And yes, it's emotionally charged. But the emotions aren't the problem. It's the egocentric thinking that drives the emotion. Keep that in mind as we continue. What happens here? Why fear? Why anger? Because these are the most effective appeals to emotion. They are the most persuasive. That's why they're used so often. And in fact, we see it with Frank Luntz. I told you he'd come back. Aaron Begley's article, Roots of Fear, which I forgot to put a link to it here. I think I reference it later with a link. Quote, the key to emotional language is its simplicity and clarity, says Frank Luntz. It has to be immediately believable and authentic. If it requires you to think, it's less powerful. If it requires you to explain, it's less powerful. In other words, use slogans. Use cliches. Use things that everyone gets immediately and doesn't have to spend a second thinking about it. I'm interested in that 80% of you that's emotional, not the 20% that's intellect. You see that here. This is problematic. Does it work? It does. It does work. But, as John Morley puts it, you have not converted a man because you have silenced him. Put in other terms, you may have persuaded one to act in one way or another, but you've not convinced them, if that's what you're interested in doing. But as we see, too often people are uninterested in actually convincing someone. They're more interested in getting what they want in the short term, and that may be persuasion. And dang it, that link's not working anymore. This is going to be the daisy chain. Daisy, what is it? With the daisy, she's counting off the petals. 1, 2, 3, and then there's a countdown at the same time to nuclear holocaust. This was 1964 ad. It was aired once and only once. People were so angry about it because it was such an obvious appeal to our fear. It basically was Lyndon Johnson saying, these are the stakes. We must love each other or we must die. That's what it was. Since I can't play it for you, I've got to just reenact it. Basically saying, vote for me or nuclear holocaust. That's 1964. There was always stuff like that. But we didn't have a stomach for it then. It's become normalized now. And you're going to see a lot worse than that. And you see images like this where you associate, this is a scare tactic, right? Radical leaders prey on the fearful and the naive. And then it just says, live free or die. And it is appealing to fear here as well. Associating change, National Socialism, change, Marxist socialism with Lenin, and of course the Hitler reference, and then democratic socialism, and of course there's Obama. This appeal to fear, this scare tactic, is in the place of proof. Fear to persuade. And it is very successful. As Edmund Burke puts it, no passion so effectually robs the mind of all its powers of acting and reasoning as does fear. Well, what's going on here? Not all appeals to fear are scare tactics. I can say to my son, don't fall into that lion's den at the zoo or whatever, because it'll eat you. And then Milo says, it's a scare tactic. No, that's genuine, legitimate. You ought to feel fear. If you don't feel fear jumping into the lion's den, that's a problem. You've got no emotional intelligence. We'll talk about that in a moment. Where does this fear go? How does it work? And here's the reading I mentioned. It's a good reading. It's accessible. It's from Newsweek, and it gets at a lot of the material that is in the background of Linda Elder's text. It's not that long, and she references a lot of the people that Elder references in her text as well. How does fear affect our thinking? In one study, they asked a number of people, how much would you pay for these life insurance policies? And significant percentage chose to pay more for death by terrorism than they would pay for death by any cause. And the reason is because terrorism gives us this, it appeals to what Daniel Kahneman refers to as the availability heuristic. The imagery is available and immediate to us, and that changes the way that we think. And it gets us to reason poorly. And the emotion, the fear, overrides our capacity to think. Why is this irrational? to pay more for this than for that?
Any cause of terrorism.
Because death by any cause covers terrorism, presuming that that's a cause. Bless you. Do you see? But we sometimes fail to recognize that. I got appealed to my fear once when there was a storm that blew through our neighborhood in Rockford, knocked down these 2 giant trees. I might have mentioned this to you. Fell onto our roof. And I was afraid. I was like, oh my God, are they going to come through the roof? And then some random dude comes to the front door. Hey man, you need somebody to help you get those trees off your roof? I said, yeah, I just called a reputable place. I didn't say it that way because he didn't look reputable. He said, well, I can get that taken off your roof now. I was like, what? Yeah, me and my kids. And I didn't notice. I didn't see his kids. They were like 12 and 15. I didn't notice that at the time. And he said, me and my kids will get that off for you. We won't even charge that much. And I said, you need to get that off soon, the guy said. There's like 2 cement trucks sitting on your ceiling. You got kids in there? That's what he asked. I said, yes. Well, you need to get this taken care of. And I said, all right. Bad mistake. I fell prey to fear. They did a horrible job. And it was weird. It was a pickup truck with 2 kids, and they got, that was a weird memory. I don't want to go through it all. But I made a mistake. I should not. I had to stop them halfway through. Sorry, folks, you're not doing this right. You're destroying other things. It's dangerous to have your 12-year-old with a what's the thing? Chainsaw? Yeah. This is crazy. I'm going to have to pay you for half of what I was going to pay you and have you go. It's a terrible situation. But I fell prey to fear. Does this mean all emotions are problematic? Linda Elder says no. You click on our link, you can see a lot more of her research and what she's been working on. I introduced her at the beginning of class today. What's wrong with emotion? She's concerned about the Platonic division of Plato's division of emotional beings and reasonable beings. Philosophers are reasonable beings. Guess who's not? What eventually happens throughout history. Certain groups of people are divided as such. Linda Elder's worried about this. She doesn't focus on that distinction in this text. But she does focus on the problems of presuming there is a dichotomy, that there's not an intertwining of emotion and reason, that emotional and intellectual intelligence, if you will, can overlap. As she says on the first page, quote, emotional intelligence can reasonably be conceived as a measure of the degree to which a person successfully or unsuccessfully applies sound judgment and reasoning to situations in the process of determining emotional or feeling responses to those situations. End quote. What does that mean? What does it mean to bring to bear our intellect with respect to our feeling? Which of the following seems more of a reasonable reaction, let's say, after being cut off by a pickup truck? This guy or this guy? Anger and rage, or whatever that is. Joy? I'm not sure what that is. I once was cut off by a pickup truck. Guy cut me off, and then seconds later, he stuck his hand out the window and did this. Kind of like, oh, sorry. And my rage at him cutting me off dissipated immediately. It was incredible. It's amazing how brief interactions can change one's response. In cars, it's tough to do that. Sometimes that doesn't work. I mean, if I'm walking down the street and I run into you accidentally, I'm going to like, oh gosh, I'm sorry. But when you're in a car, you don't react that way. It's, oh, you just cut me off. I'm going to follow you and make sure you see my angry face and do that. That's irrational. But is anger and rage always irrational? What if this guy, oh no, this is the car, and this is his reaction. What if I'm driving, I don't just cut him off, but I smash into his car where his kids are in it. And I know his kids are in it because he's got that sticker that says kids on board.
Baby on board.
Baby on board, yes. Why do people put that there? Drive cautiously around me because there's a baby on the car. If there's no baby, then you can drive any way you wish. Is this the implication? However, this reaction doesn't make sense. That's inconsistent. If I'm seeing somebody being mistreated and I don't react appropriately emotionally, Aristotle tells us. So Aristotle's already moving against this Platonic division. If I'm angry, I better be angry, as you recall from a couple times ago, in the right way, against the right person, to the right extent, at the right time. There's all sorts of criteria. It isn't just, being angry is great or terrible. Being angry in the right way is hard. Failing to be angry can be a problem. Right? You've seen the bumper sticker. If you're not outraged, then you're not paying attention. Well, that's not really saying much. What is the content? What is the situation? And as I even mentioned before, there's a link to this NPR special, Hidden Brain by Shankar Vedantam, on the logic of rage. And there it seems there are situations in which that's acceptable. But it's not something you can control, your rage. In fact, he talks about it as blind rage, implying it's uncontrollable. Is it? What does Linda Elder think? Do our reasons move our emotions, or is it our emotions that drive our thinking? Or is it a little bit of both? And note the root of emotion. I've touched on this before. Motivation, emotion, it's not coincidental that those two have similar etymological roots. She says every defect in emotion and drive creates a defect in thought and reason. Critical thinking then enables us to form sound beliefs and judgments, and in doing so, provides us with a basis for rational and reasonable emotional life. We can take control of our emotions because there is not an emotion that doesn't have thinking undergirding it. And there's not a thought that doesn't have a motivating emotion behind it. And she makes the case that if I'm afraid or if I'm angry, it's always a fear and an anger of something. I don't just have fear. I don't just have anger. I might have angst in the existentialist sense, where it's unclear what my despair is directed at. She doesn't talk about that, interestingly, but that's perhaps for another time. But when I'm angry, presumably I have thoughts that preceded that anger, that brought about that anger. I have to have an anger about something. There's an injustice, and I'm angry about it. It's not anger with no content, with no thought. That's weird. As she puts it at one point, if that were the case, then all emotions would be identical. They just happen. But that seems absurd. It seems we have to have thinking first that brings up the emotions. But, reciprocally, the thoughts only happen to the extent that we have some motivation to think about them. Because thinking takes energy. Conscious thought. We're, as Daniel Kahneman puts it, cognitive misers. Lazy. We don't like to use a lot of mental energy if we can avoid it. And so anytime I spend moments of thought, I'm focusing, I'm choosing to think about this instead of any other multiplicity of things I could be thinking about. That requires some motivation to focus on those thoughts. So it's a reciprocal relation. I'm not going to show this here, but it is an excellent video. It's a bit dated. A PBS special, The Secrets of the Mind, with a neuroscientist named V.S. Ramachandran. And in it, there's a case, starting on minute 29, of explaining the cockroach delusion. And here we can see an example of somebody who, in Elder's conception, might lack emotional intelligence. Although, keep in mind how her conception of reasons connecting with emotions, how that might apply or not apply here. Has anyone heard of the cockroach delusion? It's where you claim your parents, for example, are imposters, while at the same time recognizing they look exactly like your parents. They act exactly like your parents. Intellectually, logically, they're your parents. But I have no feeling. I have no emotional connection to them. And because of that lack of emotional connection, you arrive at a weird logical conclusion. They're imposters. That's the cockroach delusion. Ramachandran studied this biologically, neuroanatomically. And the individual who suffered from this cockroach delusion had damage to his brain. And in the brain, there are two pathways to consciousness that he talks about. That's a little oversimplification. But one of the pathways goes through the amygdala. The other goes straight through to the prefrontal cortex and areas of the brain there, where things become conscious. And there's a lot more to it than that, of course. And in this patient, there was damage to the pathway that connects to the amygdala, which is mentioned in the text for your reading today. seen as the gateway center to the emotions. I don't think Elder likes it to describe it that way, as if we can have parts of the brain that are emotional, parts that are rational. I think she's right that carving it up that way is too simplistic. In any case, this patient, the images do not make it to his emotional centers. And because of that, he has no emotional connection to those individuals. And so concludes they're imposters. That shows intimately the connection between thinking and feeling. And that we make mistakes intellectually, reasonably, rationality-wise, we're irrational, when we fail to have the appropriate emotions. If I don't actually feel fear in front of a tiger, then I'm going to make some stupid choices. I'm not courageous. Courageous is not lacking fear, as the book Frog and Toad incorrectly assumed. I was reading that with my kids years ago. Frog and Toad, fans of them? Very philosophical. Frog or Toad said, courage is being without fear. And then Frog or Toad said, yeah, that's right. And I said, no, that's not. That's wrong. Completely wrong. If you don't have any fear, then you're just foolish. Or you're lacking emotional intelligence. Her argument, instead of dividing emotion and reason, it ought to be divided egocentric and non-egocentric. She discusses this on page 5. There is thinking that underlies our emotions, and the emotions that drive our thinking. That's the most simplistic overview of her text. Thought and emotion are not like oil and water. Instead, they are inseparable constituents of human cognition. And when you see it this way, you are forced, if you want, to avoid this strict, dichotomous, presumably binary way of looking at individuals with respect to reason and emotion, and groups too, as we're going to see later on. And this is very appealing for a number of reasons. It's appealing because it also gives us a reason to say you're responsible, and a positive view. You can improve yourself. You can improve how you feel by improving how you think. Here are some final questions. Does Linda Elder place too much emphasis on the connections between reason and emotion? Consider the example of the murderer. Remember in the case she references Daniel Goleman. She's responding to Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence. She thinks Goleman does this traditional mistake of dividing up emotion and reason. And Goleman gives the example of a convicted murderer who snaps, loses it, lost his mind, overcome by emotion. And that description seems to lead to the possibility of exculpating, that is to say, not guilty, by reasons of insanity. What does insanity mean? My reason is lost. I'm overcome by emotion. To which Elder says, no. That's to remove responsibility. That takes away the responsibility for the individual who committed the crime. And part of us, if we want, would say, that's right. You're not free of guilt just because you were overdriven by emotion. That was your ego. That was your egocentric thought. I'm going to act this way to protect myself. That's not overly emotional thinking. That's overly egocentric thinking, according to Elder. And perhaps we like that. Perhaps that makes sense. Until we look at the other example she gives. Page 5. Predictable emotional reactions are typically, maybe these are Weaslers, maybe these are ways of her avoiding the accusation I'm about to levy against her. We're almost there. Are typically a product of egocentric thinking. Emotions that are commonly egocentric include defensiveness, irritability, arrogance, anger, apathy, indifference, which in apathy and indifference are similar, alienation, resentment, and depression. What? Turn that frown upside down, you might say to somebody who's depressed. You're being too egocentric, person who just came to me and told me you were depressed. What have I just done? I have told the person who is depressed that they're responsible for their depression. Does not Elder's arguments, if taken too far, lead to too much burden on an individual? Too much emphasis on thinking and responsibility, not just for our thinking, but for the emotions that arise from that thinking. Do you see what I mean? That's something I want to leave you with, because it's not an obvious, I don't know what the obvious answer is to that. Another question that's related, isn't the emotional and unconscious elements or parts, aspects of our brains faster than the cognitive, conscious, top-down processing of the brain? She discounts this and says, no, there's always thinking. Even before our heuristic immediacy of action and emotive feelings. What about the fight or flight mechanism? I jump because I see a snake. Did I consciously see a snake and then think, is that a snake? And is it a poisonous snake? And what's that poem? Red and yellow kill a... I'm not going through all that. You're jumping out of safety. And it's emotional, it's immediate, it's non-conscious. But she might argue there's still thoughts. That's something we can talk about next time. And if you have the chance to watch the video, Presidential Election 2016, Basket of Deplorable Logical Fallacies, there's a subtitle to it. All of that. I was going to title it, and what the fuck do we do now? But I'm not going to be that person. I don't want to be the person who has the word fuck in the title of their presentation. Not going to do it, so I won't do it. And I just engaged in what?
I think you should.
I did, though. So what is that called, remember? Parallipsis. Parallipsis. So we'll end with parallipsis. Okay. I'll see you next time. Make sure you read Lawrence Blum. Note the page numbers. Don't read the whole thing unless you have time. It's pretty long. And Eugenio Saldivar's Tendentious Jokes Are Immoral. Take care, y'all.